Claire Thompson gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, her eyes fixed on the road that wound through endless flat fields of Missouri farmland. The horizon was low and grey, heavy clouds threatening rain again, though the soil on either side of the road still carried scars of a flood that had drowned the valley just months earlier. She glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her son, Ethan, slouched against the window in the back seat, his headphones pressed tightly over his ears. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left St. Louis, and Claire knew why. This move wasn't his choice. It was hers. She inhaled sharply, the damp scent of wet earth seeping even through the closed car windows. The farmhouse they were heading toward wasn't her dream home, but it was the only place she could afford after the divorce had drained her savings and left her with a small settlement. She told herself it was an opportunity to start over, to build something new for Ethan, away from the painful reminders of what they'd lost. "Almost there," she said, though Ethan didn't respond. His shoulders were hunched, his reflection in the window hard to read. When the old farmhouse finally appeared, standing crooked at the edge of a field, Claire's breath caught. The white paint peeled in strips, the porch sagged under years of neglect, and the windows looked clouded as if they too carried secrets. The land stretched wide and lonely around it, a patchwork of mud, corn stubble, and the faint shimmer of water pooled in low places. Claire forced a smile. "It just needs some love," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. He finally pulled off his headphones. "It looks haunted." "Not haunted," she countered quickly. "Just waiting for us to give it life again." But her own voice carried a tremor she couldn't hide. A new chapter of life always begins with hesitation. For Claire, that hesitation felt like walking into a house still damp from the floodwaters that had nearly swallowed it. She didn't know yet what the walls would reveal, or what kind of resistance she would face in a town where outsiders were watched carefully. What she did know was that she couldn't turn back. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because stories like this one unfold piece by piece and you won't want to miss what comes next. The key turned stiffly in the front door. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of mildew and dust, a stale mix that hit the back of her throat. The floorboards creaked under their weight, swollen from water damage. Claire ran her fingers along the cracked wallpaper, feeling the dampness still clinging beneath. It was worse than she'd imagined, yet something about it stirred an odd determination in her. "Mom, it's gross," Ethan muttered, kicking aside a broken tile. "It's ours," she replied firmly. "That means we get to fix it." In truth, she was terrified. Every repair would cost money she barely had. Every wall peeled back was a reminder that she was standing at the edge of failure. Still, this house represented her last chance to prove she could survive on her own terms, without her ex-husband's shadow or pity from well-meaning relatives. As they explored, Ethan tapped a wall with his knuckles. "Sounds hollow," he observed, his curiosity momentarily pushing aside his sulkiness. Claire dismissed it with a shake of her head. "Old houses make all kinds of noises." "Don't worry." Yet later, as she unpacked their few boxes, the sound echoed in her mind, a hollow rhythm, as if the house itself was whispering a story she couldn't yet hear. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling loose shingles and carrying the faint smell of the nearby river. The town lay a few miles down the road, a place she had never set foot in until today. Its people, she imagined, were already gossiping about the divorced woman who bought the flooded farmhouse. She could almost hear their voices. "She won't last. City folk never do." Claire squared her shoulders, pushing the thought away. She hadn't survived the courtroom battles of divorce and uprooted her life to be defeated by gossip or mildew. This was the start of something, even if it felt fragile and uncertain. "Ethan," she called softly, finding him perched on the sagging porch steps. "We're going to make it work. You'll see." He didn't answer right away. Then, with a sigh that seemed far too heavy for 12 years old, he said, "I hope so." Claire placed her hand on the porch railing, rough wood biting into her palm. Somewhere in the silence between them, she felt the weight of the house pressing down, as if it carried the memory of more than just floods. She didn't yet know how true that was, but soon she would. The morning after their arrival, Claire stood in the kitchen staring at the faded linoleum floor, water-stained and curling at the edges. She had scrubbed for hours, but the smell of mildew still clung to the air. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting light across fields that shimmered with leftover floodwater. The house might have been battered, but the land around it felt endless, open and unforgiving. "Mom, the faucet's making a weird noise," Ethan called from the bathroom. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, bracing herself. Another problem already. When she checked, water trickled out in an uneven stream, sputtering and brown. She forced a smile. "We'll get it fixed, one step at a time." But every step seemed heavier than the last. Later that week, Claire drove into town for supplies. The streets were quiet, lined with brick buildings whose paint had faded under years of harsh sun and floods. A few shops stood open, a hardware store, a diner with a neon sign that buzzed faintly, and a grocery with a hand-painted welcome banner. She parked in front of the diner, her old sedan drawing a few curious stares from locals sipping coffee outside. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee hit her instantly. A waitress in her 60s, hair pulled back tight, approached with a cautious smile. "Haven't seen you around before. Passing through?" "No, actually," Claire said, trying to sound confident. "I just moved into the old farmhouse off Mill Creek Road." The waitress's smile faltered. For a second, something unspoken passed in her eyes before she covered it with practiced cheer. "Well, I'm Martha Jenkins. Welcome to town. Coffee?" "Yes, please." Claire slid into a booth, aware of conversations pausing around her. She could almost feel people watching. When Martha returned with the coffee, she lowered her voice. "That house has history. Folks might take a while to warm up. Don't let it bother you." Claire nodded politely, though her chest tightened. Even here, among strangers, she was already marked as an outsider. That afternoon, Ethan trudged home from school, his backpack dragging low. He dropped it on the floor with a thud. "How was your first day?" Claire asked, trying to keep her tone light. He shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "Kids asked where I live. When I told them, they laughed. Said only desperate people buy that place." Claire's stomach twisted. "Kids can be cruel. Give it time, Ethan. They'll come around." He kicked at a loose floorboard. "What if they don't?" She wanted to reassure him, but the truth was, she didn't know. That evening, while sorting through bills at the kitchen table, Claire realized her savings were draining faster than she had planned. The water damage was worse than expected. She would need steady income, but jobs in town were scarce. The next morning, she returned to the diner and asked Martha if they were hiring. "We could use an extra pair of hands," Martha said, eyeing her kindly now. "It's not much, but it's honest work." "I'll take it." Claire's first shift was grueling. The regulars eyed her with curiosity, some polite, others whispering when they thought she wasn't listening. Yet there was a small sense of relief in the rhythm of work, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, wiping counters. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, she felt a fragile thread of stability. After her shift, Deputy Rick Lawson walked in. His uniform was pressed, his expression steady but guarded. "You're the new owner of the farmhouse, right?" he asked after ordering coffee. "Yes," Claire said, meeting his gaze. "Why does everyone seem so concerned about it?" Rick hesitated, then shrugged. "Old houses, old stories. People around here don't forget easily. Best thing you can do is keep your head down." Claire forced a smile, but his words only deepened her unease. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, pushing peas around his plate. "Do you think we'll ever fit in here?" he asked quietly. Claire reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We will. It just takes time." Outside, the wind whistled across the empty fields, carrying with it the lingering doubts of a town that wasn't ready to accept them. Yet, in the quiet of that moment, Claire promised herself she wouldn't let the whispers break them. She had chosen this place, and somehow she would make it home. The days blended into one another, each marked by the steady rhythm of repairs that never seemed to end. Claire spent her mornings at the diner, coming home in the afternoons with aching feet and just enough tips to buy groceries and patch one small corner of the house. By evening, she found herself staring at peeling wallpaper and warped boards, the weight of her decision pressing down harder each day. One Saturday she stood in the living room with a stack of estimates from contractors. Each sheet of paper was a reminder that the farmhouse required far more money than she had. The foundation alone needed reinforcement, the plumbing was outdated, and the roof leaked every time rain clouds passed over. She rubbed her temples, whispering, "What was I thinking?" Ethan, sprawled on the couch, didn't look up from his sketchpad. "Maybe we should just sell it and go back to the city." Claire froze. "We can't," she said firmly, though her voice cracked. "This is our chance, Ethan. We just need to hold on." He sighed, pressing his pencil harder against the page. "It doesn't feel like a chance. It feels like a punishment." The words stung, though she knew he hadn't meant them cruelly. He was 12, caught in the middle of a change he never asked for. Still, hearing her son's doubts echoed her own, and for a moment she wondered if she had dragged him into a life destined to fail. That night, rain returned, steady against the roof. Claire tucked Ethan into bed, lingering by his door longer than usual. She listened as the house settled, the creaks and groans louder with the damp. Then came a sound she couldn't place, an odd hollow thud from inside the wall near Ethan's room. "Did you hear that?" Ethan sat up, wide-eyed. Claire forced a smile. "It's just the pipes. Old houses are noisy." But her stomach tightened as she stroked his hair. She'd grown up in an old house, and these sounds felt different, like something moving behind the plaster, deliberate and heavy. She dismissed it, telling herself exhaustion made her imagine things. Still, as she lay awake in her own room, the hollow thuds replayed in her mind. At the diner the next day, Martha noticed the dark circles under Claire's eyes. "You look like you haven't slept," she remarked gently. "Just adjusting to the house," Claire replied with a weak laugh. Martha gave her a long, knowing look. "That place has a way of keeping folks up at night. Don't let it eat at you." Claire bristled. "It's just repairs, I'll manage." But inside, she wasn't so sure. Back home, Ethan had dragged a chair to the wall in his room. Claire found him tapping it rhythmically, listening to the echoes. "Ethan, stop that. You'll drive yourself crazy." He turned to her, eyes shining with curiosity. "It's not just pipes, Mum. It's hollow like something's inside." Her patience snapped. "Enough. We don't have the time or money for nonsense. We need to focus on fixing what's in front of us." The disappointment on his face made her regret the harshness instantly. Still, she couldn't let him see her cracks. He needed her steady, not unraveling at the seams. That evening, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the condensation running down the glass. She thought about St. Louis, the apartment they'd left, the friends Ethan had walked away from, the familiarity she'd abandoned. The farmhouse had seemed like hope when she signed the papers. Now it felt like a cage filling with water she couldn't bail out fast enough. Yet deep inside, another voice whispered, "You can't turn back, you've come too far." She glanced at the walls, the faint sound of dripping water echoing somewhere deep within. Her heart beat faster. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe the house wasn't just old. It was hiding something. But for now, survival came first. She blew on her tea, watching the steam rise, and told herself tomorrow would bring strength, even if the walls seemed determined to keep their secrets. On a damp Tuesday morning, Claire pulled on work gloves and stared at the living room wall where the wallpaper had bubbled and peeled away. Mold had crept through in dark blotches, leaving the surface soft and spongy. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a utility knife and sheer determination, she began slicing through layers of faded paper and crumbling plaster. Each scrape released a stronger, musty odor. Dust filled the air, catching in her throat. She pressed forward, coughing, convinced that repairing the walls would be one step closer to reclaiming control of the house. "Need help?" Ethan asked, appearing in the doorway with a cautious look. "Homework first," Claire said automatically. He hesitated, then grinned. "But this looks way more interesting." Before she could argue, he grabbed a hammer and started tapping lightly at the exposed lath. The hollow echo returned, clearer this time. Ethan's eyes widened. "Told you, Mom." "There's something in there." Claire paused, her breath shallow. She told herself it was just insulation or leftover junk. Still, curiosity tugged at her. "Step back," she said firmly. She wedged the hammer claw into a soft spot and pulled. The panel splintered away, and behind it lay a narrow cavity. From the shadows inside, something pale and flat stuck out. Claire reached in cautiously, her fingers brushing against brittle paper. She pulled out a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth, edges stained by water. Ethan leaned closer. "What is it?" Claire set the bundle on the floor and peeled it open. Inside were photographs, yellowed with age, their corners curling. Black and white images of stern-faced farmers, children posed in front of barns, and a family gathered on the very same porch where she and Ethan now sat each evening. "These people lived here," she murmured. Among the photos were letters, written in careful cursive, the ink faded but legible. Claire picked one at random and read aloud, "The land surveyors cheated us. They said the boundary line was moved, but it was all lies. If this gets out, it will ruin them." Her voice faltered. She glanced at Ethan, whose expression mixed excitement and unease. "There's more," he urged. She flipped through the stack, receipts for corn sales, ledgers of livestock, and more letters filled with bitter words about betrayal, lost acres, and disputes that stretched across seasons. Each piece felt like a fragment of a story that had unraveled within these very walls. Ethan whispered, "Why would someone hide this stuff in the wall?" "To keep it safe," Claire answered slowly. "Or to make sure no one ever found it." For the rest of the afternoon, they sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, sorting through the papers. The farmhouse seemed to breathe differently around them, as though it had been waiting decades for someone to peel back its skin and reveal its memory. At one point, Claire found a photograph that made her pulse quicken. A group of men standing in front of the courthouse in town, their expressions grim, almost defiant. Scrawled on the back was a single word, Danners. "Who are they?" Ethan asked. "I don't know," Claire admitted, but the name lingered in her mind. As evening fell, she stacked the discoveries neatly on the kitchen table. Looking at them made her both nervous and strangely protective, as if she'd been handed someone else's family secrets, secrets that didn't want to stay buried. That night, while Ethan slept, Claire read through more of the letters by the dim light of a lamp. The handwriting spoke of neighbors turning against each other, of accusations, and of land that had been stolen or unfairly divided. Though decades old, the anger in the words felt raw, alive. Her thoughts churned. She had moved here to escape drama, not uncover it. And yet, staring at the fragile paper in her hands, she sensed that this discovery might explain why the farmhouse had always carried a strange heaviness. For the first time since arriving, Claire felt less like the owner of the house and more like its keeper, someone chosen to find what had been hidden. She folded the letters carefully, her heart unsettled. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask about the name Danner. Someone in town had to remember, and somehow she knew the answers would not come easily. The next day, Claire decided to visit the local library, hoping to dig deeper into the name Danner. It wasn't much, just a few dusty shelves and a collection of old newspapers, but she was determined to find something that could piece together the fragmented letters she'd uncovered. The library smelled of mildew, the kind that clung to old paper and thick wooden beams. A librarian, middle-aged and wearing a cardigan, gave her a polite but curious look as Claire started flipping through the yellowed pages of the town archives. She was halfway through a 1960s edition of the Mill Creek Gazette when a voice interrupted her. "You're digging through all that for a reason, aren't you?" Claire turned to see a man standing by the desk. He was in his early 40s, wearing a faded sheriff's jacket and a hat that seemed out of place indoors. His eyes were sharp, though his expression was neutral, as if he'd dealt with too many outsiders asking the same questions. "Just looking for some history," Claire said, trying to sound casual. "I'm new to the area, and I came across the name Danner in some old papers." His jaw tightened. "The Danners, huh?" His tone was a mix of irritation and something else Claire couldn't place. "Best you leave that alone, ma'am. There's a reason those names don't get mentioned much." Claire met his gaze, unfazed. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on. It's my house now. I'm entitled to know." The sheriff took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand. People in this town, they remember. Digging into things better left alone, well, it doesn't end well for anyone. The warning was clear, and the weight of it settled over her like a thick fog. But Claire wasn't one to back down. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease bubbling in her chest. He hesitated. "No," he said finally, "just a piece of advice." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving Claire to wrestle with the unsettling words. After the encounter with the sheriff, Claire felt a strange knot forming in her stomach. She had come here looking for answers, not warnings. As she sat in the library scanning the old papers again, the unease grew. It wasn't just the sheriff. The town itself seemed to hum with an undercurrent of tension, one that pulled her deeper into its grip each day. When she returned home later that afternoon, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, fiddling with the old photographs again. His fingers traced the edges of the picture of the Danner family. "Mum," he said slowly, "do you think the people in these pictures are still around?" Claire hesitated, her mind racing. She had been wondering the same thing. But what if the Danners were still around, watching, or worse? Had they been silenced by the town's long-held secrets? "I don't know, Ethan," she said softly, setting down the papers. "But I need to find out. I can't let this go." She knew she had to confront the town to ask the hard questions. But now it felt more dangerous than before. People were clearly invested in keeping the past buried, and Claire was beginning to realize that uncovering it might be harder and more costly than she'd ever imagined. The next morning, Claire stopped by the local coffee shop. The air inside was thick with the scent of freshly ground beans and conversation, but as soon as she stepped in, the chatter dropped. A few heads turned in her direction, their expressions cool. Martha, who was behind the counter, smiled tightly. "Can I get you something, Claire?" she asked, but there was a strain in her voice. "I just wanted to ask a few questions about the Danners." Martha's smile faltered. "I think you should drop it, Claire." She lowered her voice. "People here don't like it when old wounds get picked at." "But I don't understand why," Claire said, her frustration mounting. "I found papers in my house, letters, photographs. It's like they're trying to hide something. I have a right to know." Martha leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you want answers, but not all answers are worth knowing. The Danners, whatever you think you've uncovered, it's best left in the past." Claire stared at her, a cold shiver running down her spine. There was something more going on, something the town wasn't ready to admit. Martha pulled back, glancing around the shop. "Just be careful, Claire." She turned away, busying herself with another order. Outside, Claire stood still for a moment, the weight of Martha's words pressing down on her. The more she tried to dig, the more resistance she faced. She had expected pushback, but this felt different. As she made her way back to the farmhouse, she realized that the walls in this town were higher than she'd anticipated. And if she wasn't careful, they would close in on her too. But Claire wasn't about to stop. The truth was out there, hidden in the walls of the farmhouse and buried in the town's past. And she would find it, no matter what it cost her. As the days passed, Claire felt the weight of isolation pressing down harder than ever. The town's cold shoulder was one thing, but it was the distance growing between her and Ethan that really took its toll. He barely spoke at home, spending most of his time either holed up in his room or roaming the house, tapping at walls like he was still searching for something hidden. She knew his loneliness mirrored hers, but neither of them had the words to bridge the gap. Work at the diner was becoming a blur of empty routines. The regulars still eyed her with that mix of curiosity and suspicion, but it was the silence that struck Claire the most. Not a single person had come by to offer help with the house. No neighbor, no friendly advice, no welcome to the community. The few times she'd ventured into town, she could feel the stares lingering behind her back, the whispers just out of earshot. Even Martha, the only person who had shown any warmth at first, had become more distant. Their conversations now were terse, almost as if Claire's persistence had unsettled her too. One morning, after Claire had asked once again about the Danners, Martha's tone had shifted, no longer the gentle concern of a neighbor, but something more guarded. "It's better not to ask, Claire," she had said, her eyes flickering nervously. Some things are better left forgotten. Claire didn't know what to believe anymore. Every answer seemed to bring more questions, and each unanswered question made the house feel colder, more distant. Even the walls, once full of promise, now seemed to hum with the secrets they were keeping from her. By the end of the week, Claire felt herself retreating inward. Her exhaustion, both physical and emotional, had drained her of the drive to push forward. The house was slowly falling apart around her, and the weight of it was sinking her deeper. Every crack in the walls felt like a personal failure, a reminder that she had made a mistake. The relentless silence of the farmhouse echoed in her mind, every creak and groan now a reminder of how much she didn't know. Ethan had grown more withdrawn, and Claire noticed that the light in his eyes, the curiosity he had once had for their new life, was dimming. He hardly spoke about school anymore, though Claire knew the bullying hadn't stopped. He'd grown used to the muttered comments, the quick glances and the sudden silences when he entered a room. One evening, after he had come home late from school, Claire caught him staring at the walls again, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't look up at first, his expression distant. "Just listening." "Listening to what?" "The house," he said slowly. "It's trying to tell us something." "I think we're missing it." Claire's heart sank. She didn't know how to answer him. She wanted to tell him to stop, to focus on something more real, but there was a part of her that understood. Maybe the house wasn't just old, it was full of stories. Maybe Ethan, with his open mind, could sense them in a way she couldn't. But she couldn't let herself get lost in those stories, not when she had so much to handle. The next day, while she was cleaning the kitchen, a note slid under the door. It was folded simply, no name or address. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Leave the house, you're digging up things better left buried." Her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the threat was clear. Claire felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing. The weight of the warning settled heavily in her chest. Was it from the sheriff, one of the townspeople she'd angered by asking too many questions? Whoever it was, they had clearly made it their mission to drive her away. But Claire wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. She crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. The walls of the farmhouse might be closing in on her, but she refused to leave. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding the truth. That evening, as the sun sank low and the shadows lengthened, Claire stood outside staring at the vast emptiness around the farmhouse. The fields stretched out before her, quiet and still, like the town that had shut its doors to her. She felt more alone than she ever had, her thoughts a tangled mess of doubt and determination. But then she remembered Ethan, his quiet voice, his belief that the house was trying to tell them something. Maybe he was right. Maybe they weren't just fighting against the town. They were fighting against the past itself, a past that was desperate to stay buried. She turned toward the house, a deep sense of resolve settling over her. She wouldn't let fear dictate her life. She couldn't. But as she stepped back inside, the house seemed to whisper its secrets just beyond her reach. The days seemed to drag on, each one blending into the next as Claire found herself caught in the relentless cycle of work, house repairs, and growing isolation. The weight of the mystery surrounding the farmhouse pressed heavily on her, but each time she pushed a little deeper, the town pushed back harder. The warning notes, the cold shoulders, and the half-hearted advice to drop it made her question whether uncovering the truth was worth the cost. Then, one morning, as she stepped outside to collect the mail, a familiar face approached her from the end of the driveway. It was Deputy Rick Lawson. Claire froze for a moment, wary. She'd expected him to keep his distance after their last conversation. He had been polite, but his words had been laced with caution, urging her to leave the past alone. But now he walked toward her with an air of determination that unsettled her. "Morning, Claire," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were checking to see if anyone was nearby. "Morning," she replied cautiously, crossing her arms. "What brings you here?" Rick glanced around, making sure no one was watching. He took a deep breath as if weighing his words carefully. "I know you've been digging into the Danners. I figured you'd find out sooner or later." Claire's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" He glanced back down the road before stepping closer. "You're not the first person to try to find out about them. They were big news in this town once. People around here still talk about them, but not the way they should." Claire's mind raced, trying to piece together what Rick was saying. "You know something, don't you?" He nodded slowly. "I wasn't born here, but I've been in town long enough to hear the stories. And I'll tell you right now, the Danners were tangled up in some bad business, real bad. The kind of thing that could have torn this town apart if anyone found out." She leaned in, her curiosity overtaking her hesitation. "What happened to them? Why is everyone so afraid to talk about it?" Rick hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously. He seemed to struggle with something inside himself. "I don't have all the answers, Claire, but I can tell you this. You're poking around in dangerous territory. The Danners were involved in land disputes, sure, but it wasn't just about property. It was about power, control, and money. And some folks in this town don't want that to come to light." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "But the papers I found, the letters, they said something about corruption, about the land being stolen." Rick's eyes darkened, and he glanced over his shoulder again. "You're not wrong. But there's a lot of people in this town who've got something to lose if that truth comes out, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep it buried." Claire swallowed hard, her mind spinning. The weight of Rick's words was beginning to settle into her chest. This wasn't just about an old farmhouse or a family's past. It was about something much bigger, something that had the power to shake the very foundations of the town. Rick took a step back, his expression hardening. "I'm not saying you should give up, Claire. I'm just telling you it's not going to be easy. And it's going to get worse before it gets better." Claire's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people aren't going to let you keep digging, and if you don't watch your back, things might get messy." Claire stood still, the chill of his warning sinking deep. She wasn't sure if he was genuinely trying to help or if he was just trying to scare her into backing off. But something in his eyes told her he wasn't lying. "I'm not afraid," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Rick sighed, shaking his head. "You should be." With that, he turned and walked back down the driveway without another word, leaving Claire standing there, the weight of his warning hanging in the air like the damp fog that seemed to always settle over the farmhouse. Inside, Claire's mind churned. Rick had given her a glimpse into something much darker than she'd anticipated. She had always known there was more to the Danner story than the old letters revealed, but she hadn't realized just how deep the town's complicity went. This wasn't just a matter of long-held grudges. It was a web of lies, power, and buried secrets. Her fingers tightened around the letters she had found, the weight of them pressing down on her chest. For the first time, Claire wondered if she had underestimated just how dangerous uncovering the truth could be. But despite the fear gnawing at her insides, Claire knew one thing for sure: she couldn't stop now. She had come this far, and the secrets of this house and the town were no longer something she could ignore. She was in too deep, and she wasn't about to back down now. The next few days passed in a blur of tension, both in the farmhouse and in town. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break wide open. Each time she ventured into town, the air grew heavier. The once occasional whispers had turned into blatant stares, and the silence of the townspeople was more oppressive than ever. At the diner, the atmosphere felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Martha, usually so warm, barely met Claire's eyes as she refilled coffee cups. The regulars sat in their usual spots, but today, even the hum of their low conversations seemed charged with judgment. Claire didn't know whether it was her probing into the past or her increasing discomfort in the town, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Everywhere she turned, there was a sense of things being kept just out of her reach. She overheard fragments of conversations, half-sentences about the Danners or troublemakers or things best left alone. And though no one would confront her directly, Claire could feel their collective disapproval. But it wasn't just the town that was making her uneasy. The farmhouse itself seemed to be growing more restless, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to uncover something more. Strange sounds like scraping behind the walls echoed through the house, louder now, more frequent. At night, the hollow tapping was no longer subtle. It was an unmistakable rhythm that vibrated through the floors, waking Claire from her sleep. One evening, after another long shift at the diner, Claire returned home exhausted, her feet sore and her mind heavy with unanswered questions. As she stepped inside, the usual sense of familiarity felt foreign. The house felt colder than usual, and the air was thick with an almost tangible sense of unease. She stood in the entryway for a moment, listening. A noise, a knock, soft yet distinct, came from the wall near the back of the house. Claire froze, her heart racing. It wasn't the usual creak of an old house settling. This was something different, something deliberate. Without thinking, she grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the sound, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. Ethan was asleep upstairs, but she knew he had heard it too. He'd been even more on edge lately, withdrawn and distracted, staring at the walls as if waiting for them to speak. Claire reached the spot where the noise had come from, near the old pantry. She could feel her breath shallow, her pulse quickening. The flashlight beam flickered across the wooden paneling, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. She knelt down, running her fingers along the wall, trying to locate the source of the sound. There it was again, a distinct thud like something trying to break free. Claire's hand trembled as she traced a seam in the wall, pushing against the wood. It gave way with a soft groan, revealing a small hidden compartment just big enough to fit a hand. Her heart raced as she pulled the compartment open, revealing a small dust-covered box. The lid creaked as it opened, and inside Claire found more papers, more photographs. But this time there was something else. An old, faded map. It showed the very land surrounding the farmhouse, but there were marks on it, red ink circling several areas, some labeled with names Claire didn't recognize. Her fingers shook as she examined the map. This was different. This wasn't just a collection of memories or old family disputes. The markings on the map were deliberate, indicating something far more significant, something connected to the town's history. Claire was so absorbed in the map that she barely noticed Ethan standing behind her. "Mom?" he asked softly, his voice cracking. She jumped, the map nearly slipping from her hands. Ethan's wide eyes locked onto the papers. "What's that?" Claire stood up quickly, trying to steady herself. "It's nothing, Ethan, just more old stuff." Ethan took a step closer, his gaze flicking between her and the map. "I know it's not nothing." His voice was quiet, almost frightened. "I've been hearing things in the walls too, Mum. It's like the house is trying to tell us something." Claire swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be fine, but the weight of what she had found, the map, the markings, made her doubt everything. There was more to this than she had anticipated, more than she was ready for. And the tension in the house in the town was building to something she couldn't ignore. "It's just old stuff, Ethan," she said again, her voice firmer now. "Nothing we can't handle." But even as she said the words, she knew it wasn't true. The truth was, they were already in too deep and the walls around them were closing in. The days following the discovery of the map were tense, each one heavier than the last. Claire could barely sleep, her mind racing through the implications of what she had uncovered. The markings on the map, the names she didn't recognize, it all pointed to something much darker than she had imagined. She tried to push it all to the back of her mind, focusing on the repairs and the mundane tasks of daily life. But each time she walked through the house, she felt as though the walls were watching her, the silence pressing in on her from every side. Ethan was no better. He spent more and more time in his room, his thoughts clearly occupied by the same things that consumed Claire. She could see it in his eyes, the fear and fascination, the questions that weren't being asked. He was starting to understand that something wasn't right, and that made Claire's heart ache. He shouldn't have to deal with this. He shouldn't have to carry the weight of this house's secrets. One night, after another long shift at the diner, Claire returned home, hoping for some peace. But as soon as she opened the door, she sensed that something was wrong. The house felt off, darker, colder. The usual creaks and groans of the old structure were eerily absent, replaced by a strange stillness. Claire's pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight she kept by the door. "Ethan," she called out softly, but there was no answer. She moved cautiously through the house, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The silence was unsettling, almost suffocating. As she reached the kitchen, her heart skipped a beat. The back door was wide open, the wind gently blowing the curtain inside. Claire's mind raced. The door had been securely locked when she left. Someone had been inside. She rushed to Ethan's room, her breath catching in her throat as she reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, and her worst fear was confirmed. Ethan was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled as though someone had hurriedly gotten up. A cold wave of panic washed over her. Where was he? Claire's feet moved on their own as she bolted out the door, calling his name into the night. The farmhouse was surrounded by vast stretches of farmland, dark and desolate under the moonlight. She could hear nothing but the rustling of the wind and the distant croak of a frog. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice trembling with fear. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure moving through the trees near the edge of the property. Claire's breath hitched. She started running, her legs pumping furiously beneath her, the flashlight shaking in her hand. As she neared the trees, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the dim light, stood Ethan, his back to her, motionless. "Ethan!" she cried, rushing to him. He turned slowly, his face pale, his expression distant. His eyes were wide as though he had seen something that had drained all the color from his face. "Mum," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I saw them." "Who, Ethan? Who did you see?" Claire asked, panic rising in her chest. Ethan shook his head, his hands trembling. "I don't know. They were watching the house. I heard them. They came inside." Claire felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "Who came inside?" He took a deep breath, his voice shaking. "The people from the town, the ones who don't want us to know. They were looking for something. They were here, in the house." A chill ran down Claire's spine. She thought about the break-in, the open door, and now Ethan's words. Someone had been inside her house. And they weren't just looking for answers. They were looking to make sure she never found them. Claire reached out, pulling Ethan into a tight embrace. "We need to go inside. We're safe here," she said, her voice firm, though her heart was racing. But as they turned to head back to the house, the feeling of being watched lingered in the air, as if the darkness itself was waiting for them to make the next move. Once they were inside, Claire locked the door behind them and sat Ethan down at the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking as she poured him a glass of water. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. "We need to be careful. They don't want us to know the truth, but we're not going to let them scare us away. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded, though his face still looked pale with fear. But Claire wasn't sure if her words were for him or for herself. The threat was real now. Whoever had broken into the house wasn't just trying to hide the past. They were trying to erase it completely. And the more Claire uncovered, the more dangerous it became. With a deep breath, she looked around the house, feeling its weight press down on her. The walls seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for her next move. She wouldn't back down, not now. The days after the break-in felt like they were suspended in a thick fog. Claire kept the doors locked at all times, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. What had Ethan seen out there? Who were the people watching the house? She couldn't ignore the feeling that the town was turning on her, that her digging had uncovered something so dangerous, so deep, that it couldn't be allowed to surface. The next morning, Claire made her way into town with Ethan, though the drive felt different now. The weight of their discovery hung over them, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that every person they passed on the road was watching them. The sun was low, casting long shadows on the streets, and the usual quiet of the town seemed even more oppressive. When they arrived at the diner, Claire hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the handle as she took a deep breath. The place was quieter than usual. The smell of grease and coffee filled the air, but the chatter had died down as she entered. All eyes turned toward her, some curious, some wary, others with an unmistakable edge of hostility. Martha was behind the counter as usual, but her warm smile was gone. In its place was a tight, guarded expression. "Morning, Claire," she said, her voice flat. "Morning," Claire replied, trying to keep her tone light, though her heart was heavy. She ordered coffee, and as she sat at one of the booths she could feel the weight of every glance. The silence stretched on, and Claire felt the tension growing thick in the air. Finally, Deputy Rick Lawson walked in, his uniform sharp, but his face tight with something Claire couldn't place. He nodded at her briefly, but his usual calm demeanor had been replaced with something darker. "Claire," he said, his voice low, "can we talk?" Claire followed him outside, her mind racing. What had he come to say? She felt the eyes of the diner on her as they stepped out into the cold air. The wind had picked up, and the smell of rain was in the air. Rick looked around, making sure they were alone, before speaking. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop." Claire's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" He glanced back toward the diner. "The people you're poking around, the Danners, the town, they don't want their past dug up. They've kept it buried for a reason." "I'm just trying to find out the truth," Claire said, her voice growing more urgent. "I found papers, documents. There's something here, something important." Rick's eyes softened for a moment, but the tension in his face didn't fade. "You don't get it, Claire. These people have been protecting their secrets for generations. They won't let you uncover anything, and if they think you're a threat—" His voice trailed off, and for a moment, Claire saw something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, maybe. "What's going to happen if I don't stop?" Claire asked, her voice quieter now but no less determined. Rick took a deep breath. "You've already seen the break-ins, the warnings. You think that's just coincidence? This is bigger than you, bigger than me. You're not going to find any peace by digging." Claire shook her head. "I can't walk away from this. I have to know what happened." Rick's jaw tightened. "And you think you'll be the one to expose it? They'll destroy you before you get that far. And you're putting Ethan in danger too." At the mention of her son, Claire's resolve faltered for just a second. The thought of Ethan being caught in the crossfire was unbearable, but she couldn't turn back. "I'll protect him," she said firmly, though the doubt that had been gnawing at her all week crept into her voice. Rick stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm trying to help you, Claire. But the more you push, the harder it will be to stop what's coming. If you keep going, you'll regret it." Claire stood still, her breath catching. She didn't know if Rick was trying to warn her or scare her, but the desperation in his voice was real. And yet, despite everything he had said, Claire knew she couldn't turn away now. "I can't stop," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "I'm already in this too deep." Rick didn't reply. He just turned and walked away, leaving Claire standing in the cold air, her heart racing. As she made her way back to the farmhouse with Ethan, the town felt different, more oppressive. The weight of the town's secrets seemed to press against her, and Claire knew that what had started as a search for the truth was now something far more dangerous. The tension had reached its breaking point, the town had reacted, and now it was only a matter of time before something would snap. The tension in the farmhouse was palpable. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like a sign, like the house itself was whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. She had come so far, but the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it felt. The town was watching her. The sheriff had warned her. Even Rick, the deputy who had once seemed like an ally, now acted like she was walking toward a cliff. But Claire couldn't stop, not after everything she had discovered. One evening, after a long day of working at the diner and battling her growing doubts, she stood in the kitchen trying to focus on cleaning up. Ethan had been quieter than usual, his eyes glued to the pages of an old book he had found buried under the floorboards a few days before. He'd been absorbed in it for hours, hardly speaking. Claire was about to ask him what he was reading when something caught her eye on the kitchen counter, a small scrap of paper that hadn't been there before. Her pulse quickened. The paper was folded, stained with something dark, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Someone had written it recently. "They're closer than you think. Don't trust the sheriff. Don't trust anyone. It's all connected. You'll find the truth where they never wanted you to look." Her hands shook as she unfolded the note. A cold chill ran down her spine. Who had left this? How had they gotten inside? She thought back to the break-in, the warning signs. It wasn't just a random act of vandalism. Someone was trying to send a message. The words echoed in her mind. It's all connected. Connected to what? And who was they? The only thing Claire knew for sure was that whoever had left the note knew exactly what she was after. Her heart pounded as she glanced around the kitchen. The house felt more oppressive now, its walls heavy with the secrets it had been hiding for decades. She couldn't help but think of the Danner family, the land disputes, the corruption. Everything she had discovered was like a puzzle with pieces scattered across the past, but she couldn't see the whole picture yet. Suddenly, a sound came from the floorboards. Again, the unmistakable hollow thud she had heard the night before. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. This time she wasn't alone. Ethan had heard it too. His head jerked up, his wide eyes meeting hers. "Mom, do you hear that?" he whispered. Claire took a slow step toward the wall where the sound had come from, her heartbeat louder than her footsteps. She could feel the sweat on the back of her neck, but she didn't stop. She was tired of being afraid. It was time to confront whatever was hidden inside these walls. As her hand brushed the wall, she noticed something strange. The wood wasn't as solid as it should have been. With her fingers, she pushed gently, and the panel gave way, creaking open. Inside, hidden in the dark, was something small and metallic, an old, rusted box. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just dust and dirt inside the wall. This was a long-forgotten piece of the past. She reached in and pulled the box out, its weight surprising in her hands. "Is that it?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with wonder. Claire didn't answer. She could feel the weight of the box in her palms, the cold metal sending a shiver through her. She pried the lid open, and inside were more documents, more photographs, old letters. But there was something else. A faded, fragile map, similar to the one she had found weeks ago. But this one was different. It was more detailed, showing land boundaries, a series of marks in the same red ink she had seen on the other map. But this map had one major difference, a name written in the corner. Danner Holdings. Her stomach twisted as she looked closer. This wasn't just about land disputes. This was about ownership, power, and the people in this town who had gone to extreme lengths to bury the truth. The Danner family had been at the center of it all. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. The corruption, the land manipulation, the secrecy, it all led back to them. But why was the town so desperate to keep it buried? What had they done to protect themselves? Ethan stepped closer, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What does it mean, Mum? Why is this hidden here?" Claire didn't answer him right away. She was too lost in the realization of what she had found. This was more than just an old family's history. It was evidence, the very thing that could unravel the web of lies the town had been hiding for years. But there was no turning back now. Claire knew that whatever path she chose, the truth would come at a cost, and she couldn't protect Ethan from the consequences of what was coming. As she stared at the map, her fingers trembling, she made a vow to herself. She wasn't just going to uncover the past, she was going to expose it no matter what it took. The morning after Claire uncovered the hidden box, she felt the weight of her discoveries heavier than ever. The map, the photographs, the names, it was all leading her to something she wasn't ready for, but she couldn't stop now. The pieces had fallen into place, and no matter how dangerous it felt, she knew that the truth had to come out. But as she stood in the kitchen, looking at the papers scattered across the table, she realized that the cost of finding that truth was greater than she had imagined. Ethan sat on the couch, his eyes darting nervously between Claire and the papers. He was quieter than usual, clearly feeling the strain of the secrecy that had built up around them. Claire could sense his unease, but she didn't have time to comfort him. She needed to act. A sudden knock at the door broke the silence, sharp and forceful. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and she exchanged a look with Ethan. She knew who it had to be. The town wasn't going to wait for her to finish what she had started. They were coming for her now. Slowly, Claire walked to the door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. When she opened it, Deputy Rick Lawson stood in front of her, his face grim and unreadable. "Rick," Claire said, her voice tight. What are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered over her shoulder, scanning the inside of the house. Then, with a sigh, he spoke. "We need to talk." Claire stepped back, allowing him in. Ethan remained silent, watching from the living room. "I warned you," Rick said as soon as the door closed behind him. "I told you to stop digging, Claire. Now the whole town's talking. People are getting nervous." Claire crossed her arms, refusing to show the fear that churned in her gut. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just trying to figure out what happened. What's so wrong with that?" Rick's jaw tightened. "It's not about what's right or wrong. It's about survival. Some people in this town have a lot to lose if the truth comes out." "What truth?" Claire's voice was steady, though the doubt crept into her chest. "What are you hiding from me?" Rick took a step closer, lowering his voice. "It's bigger than you think, Claire. The Danners weren't just farmers. They were involved in something much darker. There's a reason why people don't talk about them. They've kept this town under their thumb for years. And if you keep pushing, you're going to drag us all into something we can't get out of." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't care about their power or their history. I care about the truth. People deserve to know what happened." Rick's eyes softened for a moment, but his expression quickly hardened again. "You don't understand. You're putting your life and Ethan's at risk. The more you dig, the more you'll bring attention to things that should never see the light of day." Claire stood tall, her resolve strengthening. "I won't stop. I can't." "Not now." There was a long pause, and for a brief moment Claire saw the frustration in Rick's eyes. He was caught between his duty and something deeper, something that kept him from doing the right thing. "I can't stop you," he said finally, his voice low. "But I'm telling you, this isn't going to end well. If you don't listen, it won't just be you and Ethan who are affected. The whole town will be in danger." Claire stared at him, her heart pounding. His words hung heavy in the air, but she couldn't back down, not after everything she had uncovered. Rick turned to leave, but then hesitated at the door. "There's more you don't know," he said, his voice softer now. "If you really want to find the truth, you need to talk to Martha." "Martha?" Claire repeated, surprised by the name. "Why her?" Rick gave her a quick look, as if weighing whether or not to share more. "She knows more than she lets on. But be careful. She's not as innocent as she seems." And with that he left, leaving Claire standing in the doorway, her mind racing. Martha. The widow who had once been friendly, who had warned her to stay away from the past. What was it that she knew? And why had Rick pointed her in that direction? As the door clicked shut, Claire's mind swirled with possibilities. She didn't know if she could trust Rick anymore, but his words had given her a new lead. She needed to find out what Martha was hiding, and fast. Turning back to Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, Claire took a deep breath. "We're going to figure this out, Ethan. Together. No more running." But deep down, Claire knew that the path ahead would only grow more dangerous. The town was closing in, and the truth she was searching for was more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The days following Rick's warning were some of the hardest for Claire. Every morning she woke to the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She was caught in the middle of a decades-old mystery, a web of lies so thick it seemed impossible to unravel. The town had closed ranks around its secrets, and the more Claire pushed, the more she could feel the danger rising. But there was no turning back now. She had found too much, and the only thing left to do was finish what she had started. But that didn't mean the cost wouldn't be high. Claire had spent the last few days trying to piece together the clues she'd uncovered, but the more she looked at the map, the more she realized how little she truly understood. There were names, markings, connections she couldn't yet see. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. That's why she decided to visit Martha. Martha had always seemed like a safe person to talk to, someone who had warned her about the dangers of digging into the town's past. But after Rick's cryptic advice, Claire wasn't sure if she could trust her anymore. Still, if there was anyone who might know more about the Danners, it was her. As Claire pulled up to Martha's house, a chill ran down her spine. The small cottage looked quiet, almost too quiet. The front yard, once neat and tended, was now overgrown with weeds. The garden that had once been Martha's pride was now neglected, its flowers wilted and sparse. It was as though the house had stopped caring, just like the rest of the town had. Claire knocked softly at the door, her knuckles brushing against the wood. She waited, but there was no answer. Hesitant but determined, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. "Martha," Claire called softly. She stepped inside. The house smelled of old wood and dust, but there was something else, something musty and forgotten, like a secret held too long. Claire moved through the dimly lit rooms, her footsteps muffled on the worn floors. Then she heard it, a creak from the back of the house. Martha appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her face pale, her expression distant. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, her voice hoarse like she'd been waiting for this visit for a long time. "Are you okay?" Claire asked, stepping closer. Martha nodded slowly, but her eyes were filled with something that Claire couldn't place. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "I should have warned you sooner, Claire. I shouldn't have let you dig." Claire's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "Rick told me to talk to you. He said you knew more." Martha's face tightened. "Rick, he's not wrong, but you don't understand what you're asking. Some things in this town are buried for a reason. People who dig too deep. They don't always come out unscathed." Claire's voice grew more urgent. "Martha, I need to know what happened." "I've found things, papers, a map. This town is hiding something, and I won't stop until I know the truth." Martha closed her eyes for a moment, as though she was steeling herself against something inside her. "You don't get it, Claire. It's not just about the past, it's about survival. The Danners were part of something much bigger. They weren't just farmers. They were connected to people who control everything in this town. If you uncover this, you won't just be digging into history, you'll be digging into the heart of the town's power." Claire felt a chill settle over her. "What power?" Martha shook her head, a sad smile crossing her face. "It's too dangerous for you. For Ethan. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. I'm not the one who should be telling you this, but you're already in too deep." Claire felt her stomach tighten. "I'm not backing down. You've told me enough to know that something is wrong. I have to finish this." Martha reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on Claire's arm. "Please," she whispered, "if you care about your son, you'll stop now. You're not just fighting against the past, you're fighting against people who will destroy anyone in their way." Claire looked at Martha's pleading eyes, torn between the desire to uncover the truth and the fear of what might come next. The room seemed to close in on her, the weight of the decision pressing down. Could she walk away? Could she let go of everything she had uncovered? But Claire knew she couldn't. "I have to keep going," Claire said, her voice steady despite the fear twisting inside her. "I have to find out what's buried here." Martha stepped back, her face clouded with sadness. "Then you're on your own. Don't say I didn't warn you." As Claire left the house, the weight of Martha's words lingered in the air. But there was no turning back now. She had made her choice. The road ahead would be dangerous. The town was closing in on her, and the truth, no matter how dark it was within her reach. The tension in the air was almost suffocating as Claire stepped out of Martha's house. The words Martha had left her with, "You're on your own," echoed in her mind, but they weren't enough to make her turn back. She had come too far, seen too much, and now the only thing standing between her and the truth was the town itself. That night, the sky was thick with clouds, as though the weather itself was holding its breath. Claire sat at the kitchen table staring at the map, the papers, the photographs, all of it laid out in front of her like pieces of a puzzle that would finally be solved. But the solution wasn't just about finding the truth, it was about surviving it. Ethan was upstairs, his silence more profound than usual. He had heard everything she said to Martha, but he hadn't asked any questions. He knew, just like she did, that the town was waiting for them to make a move, to give them a reason to force them out. Claire's fingers trembled as she traced the markings on the map, each red circle, each name. Everything pointed back to the Danners, but the connections were so much deeper than that. Whoever had been in control of the land, the power they held, it was clear that this wasn't just about family squabbles or lost property. It was about control, manipulation, and the lives of everyone in the town. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Claire's heart raced. She stood up, her breath catching in her throat. It was too late for visitors. She hadn't expected anyone to come, especially not tonight. But she knew in that moment that the confrontation she had been avoiding was about to happen. She opened the door to find Deputy Rick standing there, his face unreadable, his posture stiff. The last time they'd spoken, his warning had been clear: stop or face the consequences. But now as he stood there was no judgment in his eyes, just something colder, something more resigned. "Claire," he said, his voice low and almost apologetic, "it's time." "Time for what?" Claire's voice was steady, but her pulse quickened. "Time for you to understand," he said, stepping past her into the hallway without waiting for an invitation. "You've been digging at the wrong things, Claire. You should have walked away when you had the chance." Claire's throat tightened. She had no intention of walking away. "You think you can stop me?" she asked, her voice sharp with defiance. "You think this town's secrets are worth more than the truth?" Rick's eyes flickered with something almost like regret, but it was gone before she could register it. "It's not about the truth anymore. It's about survival, about keeping your family safe. By lying, by keeping everyone in the dark." Claire took a step forward, her gaze unflinching. "I'm not backing down. I'm going to expose what this town has been hiding for so long, no matter what it takes." Rick's face hardened, and for a brief moment, Claire saw the man who had tried to warn her before, the one who had been conflicted, unsure. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone with a purpose she couldn't quite understand. "You're playing with fire," Rick said, his voice rough, almost pleading. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Claire replied. "I know about the Danners, the land, the corruption. I know what they did to get here, and I won't let them keep hiding it. Not anymore." Rick's expression flickered, a flash of something deep and conflicted passing through his eyes. Then he stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "If you expose this, Claire, the people in this town won't just turn their backs on you, they'll destroy you. They'll make sure you never get the chance to speak the truth. And they'll come for Ethan, too." Claire's stomach dropped at the mention of her son, but her resolve only hardened. "I'm not afraid of them. They've already taken too much from this town. They won't take anything more." There was a long silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. Then, with a final, almost imperceptible shake of his head, Rick stepped back. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice carrying a sorrow Claire hadn't expected. "I didn't want this. But they'll make sure you regret it." Claire stood still, watching him as he turned and left without another word, the door swinging closed behind him. Her heart hammered in her chest. The confrontation was over, but the storm had only just begun. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened, Mum?" Claire didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure what to say. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew one thing for sure. The fight was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about surviving it. And no matter what happened, she wasn't going to let her son be dragged into the mess that was about to unfold. "Get your things together, Ethan," she said, her voice tight. "We're not done yet." And with that, Claire knew the true cost of the truth was only just beginning. The days that followed Rick's warning were the hardest Claire had ever faced. She knew the town was closing in on her. Each passing hour, each conversation, each glance felt like a countdown to something inevitable. But she refused to back down. She couldn't. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit, and she was determined to bring it into the light. Claire's heart raced as she stood in the kitchen, staring at the papers scattered across the table. The map, the letters, the photographs, everything she had uncovered was leading her toward a confrontation she wasn't prepared for, but knew was unavoidable. The weight of it all was crushing, and yet she felt more alive than she had in weeks. Ethan hadn't spoken much since Rick's visit. He was still processing everything, the danger, the secrecy, the uncertainty, but Claire could see it in his eyes. He was scared, and that fear was the last thing she wanted him to carry. He deserved better. "Mom." Ethan's voice was quiet as he stepped into the kitchen. "What happens now?" Claire didn't have an easy answer. She had always told him that they could handle anything together, that they could face whatever came their way. But now, as she looked at her son, she realized that no matter how much she wished she could protect him from the consequences of their decisions, she couldn't. "I don't know, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I'm not going to let anyone silence the truth. We'll face it together, whatever comes." Ethan nodded, his small face pale but determined. "I trust you, Mum." Her heart swelled with pride, but also with an ache she couldn't explain. This wasn't the life she had imagined for him. He shouldn't have to carry this burden. But in that moment, Claire understood something crucial. They were already in this together. There was no turning back. That afternoon, Claire made her way to the town hall, the final step in uncovering the truth. The town's power had always been hidden behind closed doors, behind the quiet murmurs of the older generation, behind the feigned ignorance of the locals. But Claire was done being afraid of what they might do. She had to confront them head on. As she entered the town hall, the air seemed to thicken, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Every eye in the room turned toward her, those who had once been her neighbors, her co-workers, the people she thought she could trust. But now, they were just a collective force of resistance. One by one, the people she had known looked away. Not one of them met her eyes except for Martha, who stood at the back of the room, her face pale but resigned. Claire walked up to the podium, her steps measured, but her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the judgment, the fear. But there was no stopping now. "I have the truth," Claire said, her voice carrying through the room. "The town's secrets are no longer safe. The Danners weren't just a family. They were part of a system of control, a system that manipulated everything in this town, from the land to the people. And it's time for all of you to face the consequences of that." The room was silent, the tension thick in the air. For a moment, Claire wondered if they would turn on her, if they would shout her down, try to bury her truth with more lies. But then, to her surprise, Martha stepped forward. "You're right, Claire," Martha said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "We've all been complicit. We've kept the past hidden, thinking it was for the best. But you were right to question it. You were right to bring it to light." A murmur rippled through the room, and for the first time, Claire felt the weight of the town's resistance crack. Martha wasn't the only one who had been keeping secrets. Claire took a deep breath and continued, her voice stronger now. "This town is built on lies, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We can change it. We can start fresh, together. But that means we have to face what we've hidden." There was a long silence, but this time it wasn't filled with judgment. It was filled with uncertainty, with the realization that Claire had opened a door that no one could close again. Finally, someone in the back of the room stood up, then another, and another. Slowly the room began to fill with voices, not shouting, not accusing, but speaking up, acknowledging the truth Claire had revealed. It wasn't a loud victory, but it was enough. As the meeting came to a close, Claire felt the weight of the moment. She had won. The truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. But as she left the town hall and stepped out into the cool evening air, she realized that the battle wasn't over. It would take time for the town to heal, for the changes to take root. There would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Claire felt the possibility of a future where the truth no longer had to be hidden. And as she walked home with Ethan side by side, Claire knew one thing for certain. They had started something that couldn't be undone. The town had faced its past, and now they would face the future together.